Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare entrepreneurs about their lives and careers. If you like this episode, I really hope that you'll subscribe and ask your friends to do the same. My guest today is Brad Kittredge. He's founder and CEO at Brightside Health, whose purpose is to provide life-changing care for people with serious mental health conditions. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
So we're going to talk about the company, but obviously you've been through a lot before getting to that point. And maybe we'll start, if you don't mind, in the early days with your childhood. What was your upbringing like, and any childhood influences that have stuck with you?
Oh, yes. So many, as we all think back on the things we've done and the ways that they've influenced us. I'll say in the context of Brightside, the very clear one for me is that when I was in college, my parents shared with me that my father had been struggling with depression for my whole life, and that they had chosen not to really share it with the kids in the family up until that point. And it was a really eye-opening thing for me. We had a really happy childhood. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado when I was a kid, tons of activities and outdoor fun, and then was lucky to move to Santa Barbara and go to high school there. So pretty spoiled to grow up in two great places. But it really pained me to know that in retrospect, during those times, my dad was really struggling. I learned that he had had depression since he was a kid. And then when he had married my mom, and she finally convinced him to seek care, but then he had a really bumpy and challenging experience getting care. Fortunately, shortly after that period, he found a treatment that worked for him and got to a good spot, and he's been in a good spot, and he's doing great today. And now he's 80 years old, but still thriving and doing well. But for me,
so Brad, on that one,
yeah.
why did they choose to share it with you at that point in your life?
Yeah, good question. I think part of the stigma that we have around mental health as a community is that it's a very private, sensitive adult thing. And I think my parents came from an era when they felt like they didn't want to burden their kids and the family with that. And in retrospect, I wish I had known. I felt almost guilty that I hadn't been able to be aware and support my dad in that. But I was glad that they finally were able to share it with me and that we were able to work on it together as a family.
Great. So I cut you off there from, then you had some good places to go to school, and not just high school, but, beyond that.
Yeah. And then I got to go to UC Berkeley for undergrad, which was really just a phenomenal eye-opening experience. Anyone who's been to Berkeley knows that it's sort of sensory overwhelm. There are so many things to see, do, and learn there. Had just the most phenomenal experience. The truth is, though, that when I was coming out of college, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I felt like I didn't want to go sit behind a desk. I didn't want to work in finance, but I also didn't know where to go. And so I bounced around for a few years. I was a water polo player in college. And so nice. I decided just to keep trying to have fun and play water polo and travel the world a little bit. And had a ton of fun, but I also felt like I was spinning my wheels, and I wanted to apply myself and learn. And so I decided to go back to school, try to find some footing, and went to a really great program at UC San Diego in the School of International Affairs, which I think has been rebranded as the School of Global Policy Studies.
Got it.
But it was really, business, economics, and international affairs in a multidisciplinary curriculum. What I found was actually, I was really interested in a lot of the health themes, the way technology is transferred, the way that public health affects people around the world. I ended up going out of UCSD into consulting. Again, I actually was still in this phase where I wasn't sure what to do. And as many people, I think, do at that phase, it was a bit of a hedge. It was a way to get exposed to a lot of things and to learn. And I felt a little rudderless, and I was looking for some guidance. In the end, that guidance came to me in a really unexpected way, in a big surprise, where I was young, I was fit, I still felt kind of invincible almost. And then overnight, I had some health concerns. My health took a turn for the worse, And I had to actually go use the healthcare system for the first time in my life, really in a more intensive way. And I had a really hard time finding the right care for me. I had a hard time finding anyone who could help me navigate and find the next place to go, and even a hard time getting my own records and data. And I felt really unempowered. And honestly, I felt scared. I didn't know what to do. And so I went online. I was looking for resources to try to help myself. And at that point, it was 2007. Digital health didn't exist yet. There were just a couple of companies, but the only place I could find anything was in Yahoo groups where people were sharing information, trying to help each other. And I found a few things that were interesting to me, but mostly I found millions of other people like me. And that was really a turning point for me, saying this is my thing. I'm going to spend the rest of my career building tools to help people better manage their health and healthcare, because I understood that feeling of feeling unempowered. And I knew I hated it, and I knew I could help with it. Got
it. So then, where I saw on your resume a few things, before Brightside, a couple of companies that I'd heard of, one I'd forgotten about, Jawbone, and 23andMe, which is still around. ComplexDx was another one. What was the experience like at those places?
Well, based on my own experience, was when I tried to create this concept of ComplexDx. And so what I was trying to do was to reverse the search for a diagnosis. As I was bouncing around seeing doctor after doctor who was kind of shrugging at me and I didn't know where to go next, I was like, this is crazy. I am the least qualified in the whole system to figure out where to go next, but it's my job solely with no resources to try to figure it out. And so I tried to think about other ways to solve these kinds of problems. And in my own research, of course, found this huge long tail of diagnostic challenges in the healthcare system, and thought, what if you can bring all those cases together? What if you can then get the smart doctors to come look at those cases and solve them and change the way that search happens? The reality is, when I look back, it was an interesting and actually, I think, good idea, but I was totally naive. I didn't know how to start a company. I didn't know how to build a product. I fortunately had the optimism and perhaps the unrealistic optimism to use it. But I really think of that as my use case and my learning curve, where I got to explore those issues. It never had a chance, but it did really catalyze my learning and my thinking and my passion around trying to build real solutions to help people with real medical needs.
Well, I think, you did have at least the first part. It was a big enough problem worth solving. That's right. The people talk about this. I've heard it referred to as the diagnostic odyssey. And you find out that, you hear about certain conditions, time to diagnosis is in several years on average.
That's right.
And that's for somebody like you who's actively searching. So
that's right. And you hear lots of cases about people who see 20 doctors and it's the 20th one who solves it. And so I think the question is, at its essence, that sounds like a matching problem. Yeah. How do you more quickly find that person who's got the answer for you? And I think it remains an unsolved problem in healthcare and a big opportunity.
Yeah. All right. Jawbone.
Yes, I know you know of Jawbone. I think a lot of us who've spent time in digital health have an awareness of Jawbone. What an interesting story, an interesting company. When I came out of business school, I failed to mention, after I had my own run-in with health issues, I wanted to go figure out and learn about healthcare. So I did an MBA and a master's in public health at Berkeley to really try to dig in and understand how healthcare works. From there, I came out and started wanting to build products. And I heard an announcement from Jawbone that they were going into lifestyle tracking and behavior change. The company up to that point had made Bluetooth headsets and Bluetooth speakers. And so it was a big departure. And when I first saw their announcement, I thought, this doesn't make any sense. These guys don't know anything about health. But then in the end, that's actually what I liked, is that they were outsiders trying to think about health in a different way. It was, of course, a very design-centric and design-forward company. And so I was happy to jump in and join that team. I knew nothing about building hardware and very little about building software at that point. I was at the bottom rung of product management. But it was really a trial by fire, because I joined, we launched the product a couple months later, and then quickly found out that there were design flaws in the hardware that caused it to fail at unacceptable rates. The truth is that in designing the product, the team had really prioritized the design and used Eve Bahar and Fuse Project to make a really beautiful wearable band with this thesis that it's only going to work if people want to wear it. And that's a great thesis, I think. Unfortunately, it just made it really hard to build, and it wasn't designed for durability and the realities of the way people live their lives. So it started failing, and there was a big recall and a bunch of work to try to fix it. I learned so much there about all of those things about how to perhaps consider durability at the early stages of your design. Mostly what I took away from my time at Jawbone, though, was a real appreciation for the impact of great design, largely on software and on experiences, and the way that we thought about how do you actually engage people, how do you build habits and change behaviors and create and design experiences that support that, was my real learning curve and opportunity to absorb that and really get excited about the potential to use that going forward. And that's when I got a reach out from 23andMe and was really excited because they were one of the few companies in digital health that was really a digital health company. They were at this inflection point, going from really being kind of a small and hacky genetics startup to really a scaled consumer product. And my excitement was around trying to make genetics accessible, understandable, and actionable. So really excited to move over there and help build the product team. And then on my third day of work, the company got a letter from the FDA.
Yeah.
And the FDA basically said, we think that your test is a medical device. You have to stop selling it immediately and submit an application for approval. And as much as people there disagreed with that characterization of the test as a medical device, the end conclusion was, okay, the only path is that we've got to do what the FDA says. And to Anne's credit, the company really rallied around that. And the product team was one of the pillars of that submission, where we had to demonstrate 90% comprehension of core concepts in a general population sample at an 8th grade reading level. Essentially, validate that we could help 8th graders get an A in genetics.
Yeah.
And so we went through tens of thousands of people testing in qualitative and quantitative iterations to demonstrate we could do that. And in the end, we're successful and got the first approval of a direct-to-consumer genetic test. So it was painful, but one of the most formative experiences for me, in that all of my inspiration and motivation had been around this idea of patient empowerment and consumerism in healthcare. But I had a front row seat to the clash between that Silicon Valley mentality of sort of outside in innovation and the way traditional healthcare works, and the way that safety and quality have been managed with checks and balances over many decades in our healthcare system. And my conclusion after going through that was, we've got to bring those two things together in order to drive innovation going forward in healthcare. We've got to bring consumerism inside the healthcare system, but introduce it in a way that works with the way care is paid for, delivered, and regulated. And so that experience was really formative to really the solution area that I look at going forward, of building consumer grade, but also clinical grade solutions that can really change healthcare delivery.
So, Brad, I have to ask on Jawbone, are there any of those devices still around? It'd be like in a museum, or do you have any like in your desk drawer and collector's items?
Yeah, I've got like 7 of those in a drawer. I'll send you one if you want.
I'd love to have one. Yeah. I never had one of the original ones, but
Yeah.
I always thought it was a cool thing to.
It's a collector's item.
Yeah.
We had all the different colors and
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, unfortunately, you had to like plug it into your phone to download
Right.
the data off your device because Bluetooth Low Energy hadn't come out yet.
Yeah.
And so that would sap the battery too much. And so as the ecosystem has advanced, and Fitbit obviously did really well designing for durability, and you can see what success was possible in the category, Jawbone was really poised and had the pole position to take that leadership position. And unfortunately, it all came falling down.
Yeah. All right. So Brightside Health. So, you talked about your background. I can sort of see how it leads up to it. But, was there like a specific inspiration to go out and found the company?
Yeah. Well, after that experience at 23andMe, I wanted to find a company that was bringing together that consumerism and that true healthcare rigor. And I found a small startup called Lantern, and they were doing digital cognitive behavioral therapy. What I really liked about them was that they had recently gotten an investment from UPMC Enterprises. So they had a health system backing them and collaborating with them on how to actually deploy the solution in a healthcare setting. And so was really excited to join the team. Alejandro Fong is just a phenomenal leader there and great guy. And we went out to the primary care clinics in Pittsburgh, and UPMC is widely known as one of the best health systems in the U.S., but the primary care doctors there were just overwhelmed with the demand for mental health care. And in the end, they actually knew that they were the care of last resort, because even at one of these phenomenal health systems, There was a 12-week wait to refer to therapy
Yeah.
and almost impossible to get people in with psychiatry. So the PCPs knew they were the only option for these patients, but they didn't have access to measurement-based care tools or clinical decision support or the ability to monitor their patients. They were doing the best they could with really significant constraints. And that made me just think back to my father's experience and the impact that that had on him and our family, how hard it was. It took him over a decade to find the right care for him. And I just couldn't sit well with that. And that problem was largely upstream of the problem that Lantern was solving. And I thought, this is a much bigger deal. We've got systemic quality issues. And I couldn't stop thinking about how to do better to solve it. And found myself just saying, there's no better time. This opportunity is not going to come around again, and I'm not going to feel good if I let this pass me by. I was also really fortunate just with my timing historically in that we had sort of catalyzed harmonization of telemedicine laws across all the states and had a couple of good proof cases in some of the early telemedicine platforms of what was possible. That gave me a lot of precedent and solution area to think about of, okay, how do we use technology? How can we use data? How can we use specialized clinicians to actually do better? And so got the energy, talked to my wife and got her to agree to be part of this team and take this risk together. And really importantly, found a couple of phenomenal co-founders who believed in the same mission, who got excited about the same vision. And it's all been a lot of fun since then.
So how would you describe, what the company does? Like is it a big problem? And I see how the different components come together, but what's the solution that you offer?
Yeah, we're a national telepsychiatry provider. So we offer medication management and therapy for mood and anxiety disorders. So depression, anxiety, and a whole constellation of related conditions. We specialize at the higher end of severity, complexity, and acuity. So I think this is a big gap in the market. It's where the highest burden of clinical need is and the highest proportion of costs driven by people in this high severity part of the spectrum. About 4/5 of our members start with severe or moderately severe depression or anxiety. Nearly half start with suicidal ideation. So we're treating people that have really high clinical need and tend to have a really hard time finding care and finding good care. And so our mission is delivering measurably better outcomes at scale to the people who need it the most. And we've organized our whole team, our whole platform, and all of our care delivery around that.
So clearly, a serious condition is, if you can have an impact on that, it's going to have more of an impact than on something that's moderate or mild by almost by definition. Does remote care tend to be a good option for people that have serious mental illness? And what conditions is it good for? Any that it's not so good for?
Yeah, so a couple of things to note there. In the industry, when people talk about serious mental illness, they'll often be referring to things like schizophrenia. And I would say that that's different than thinking about the full severity spectrum of something like depression all the way up through the highest severity when someone may have suicidal intent. And so when we looked at that of what can work well in a remote care delivery environment, schizophrenia actually to us is not a very good fit because you need somebody to be able to engage and self-report in a reliable way as a patient in a remote environment. And people with schizophrenia tend to not to be able to do that very well. But if we look at the idea of how severe of someone with depression can you treat in a remote environment, our belief is that if you do it right, if you've got the right clinical protocols, quality and safety controls, and other approaches, that you can treat all the way up through the highest severity of depression and anxiety. And I'll give you an example. Again, I mentioned that almost half of our members start with suicidal ideation, which of course is one of the most severe symptoms of depression. We just published a paper in JMIR where we found that within 12 weeks of treatment, 77% of those people who started with suicidal ideation no longer had any. They had remission of their SI symptoms, and that was 4.3 times higher remission rate than a control group. So we're able to treat people at very high severity. And in fact, we've found that that's where the biggest gap is in the market. If you can't treat somebody there, they have the hardest time finding care. It's hard enough to find routine mental health care, but if you're someone with suicide risk, a lot of providers are very nervous to take on that case and just don't have the capacity to do so. And so I'm excited to say that we're just today, we've turned on our crisis care program, which is Brightside's ability to treat people who have active suicide intent and be able to serve people at the highest levels of severity and acuity.
So I could see on the suicidal ideation where that would certainly frighten people, including any providers, and they want to stay away from it. And the same time, it's something that you can't leave it untreated, so to speak.
That's right.
And from the standpoint of remote treatments, is there anything different about sort of like how you would start with the patient? Because one thing I could see, okay, if someone is, in the treatment over the 12-week period or whatever it may be, that's one thing. But I could see like the very first interaction, is it more difficult? Is it easier than an in-person visit? Or is it just not really different that way?
Well, one of the most important things when somebody's got that level of severity or acuity is getting them into care quickly. And so if you look at your local health system, or you look at, average across a payer network, you're generally going to be looking 3 to 6 months out for the next available appointment.
Yeah.
At Brightside, our service level is that every new patient should see an appointment option available within 48 hours. We end up seeing nearly 100% of people within 5 days of our first touch based on when they select their intake appointment. So getting in for that timely care is really critical. That intake assessment is a comprehensive intake that can include either medication management, therapy, or both of those in a comprehensive treatment plan. And so that's done by video. The reason you need video as opposed to audio only is that you can do a visual inspection of somebody. And you can see a lot of their mannerisms and their facial expressions, and understand their intonation and their dress and all these signals and cues that providers take into consideration. And so between the data we gather and that engagement in the first encounter, our providers have all the data that they need to be able to connect with that patient, form a therapeutic alliance, make a strong treatment decision, and then initiate treatment.
So I know that suicide prevention is something that's gotten you. You talked before about depression being something where there was a lot of stigma. I think suicidal ideation is right up there in terms of what people would be hesitant to really be talking about.
It is.
And at the same time, there seems to be more of an awareness at the national level, and I think even some national suicide hotline and so on. How does the philosophy of what you're doing differ from that or not? And how does like the sort of the services that you offer differ from, let's say, someone just calling that national hotline?
Yeah, great question. This is really an emerging ecosystem that has a lot of maturing to do. And so we should all be really thankful and supportive of 988 as a number and a simple way for people to be able to reach out for help. And there's a national sort of network of local crisis hotlines that's routed to, that tend to be nonprofits who field those incoming calls. The goal of those crisis hotlines is really to be a supporting voice who can de-escalate somebody in the moment, right? Who can help you to not take action today on that crisis that you're having. They are not clinicians, though. They're not care delivery. They tend to just be, a quick support in the moment. The important question, I think, is what comes next. Who do they hand them off to? How do those people then go get care that's going to be ongoing and supportive and actually de-escalate them and bring them back down from a dangerous situation? And that's the place that Brightside is filling. In the past, those resources have only had your local health system to send you off to, or your payer website to try to find a provider. And we all know how challenging and frustrating that is.
Got it. Okay. Now it's very interesting and informative. Now you talked before about some things that are, not a good fit. And you mentioned also that therapy and medical management are a part of what you do. There's a big area out there that's got a lot of attention, which is related to ADHD, which on the one hand can be serious. There's medication management element of that. But I understand that you specifically aren't involved with that.
Yeah, that's right. I would expand the consideration around ADHD specifically to just talk about controlled medication in general, because there are controlled medications that some providers would use for anxiety, things like benzodiazepines. And so as you think about the potential to prescribe controlled medications in a remote environment, whether for ADHD or anxiety or other conditions, it represents and presents you with a series of really clinical and safety considerations. So when the public health emergency was declared for COVID-19, It included a temporary relaxation of the Ryan-Haight Act, which prevented the online prescribing of controlled substances and opened the doors for telemedicine companies to be able to do that. When that happened, I sat down with our chief medical officer, Mimi Winsberg, who's a Stanford-trained psychiatrist with 30 years of practice under her belt, and said, like, what's the clinical need here? What's the opportunity for us to help people, and what's the risk, and how do we balance those? And of course, there's also the subtext of the financial opportunity. How many patients can you attract and acquire and get paid for? But we actually just left that aside. I said, financials aside, what's the right thing to do here clinically? Mimi evaluated it and came back quickly and said, it's not worth it. There's too much potential for fraud and abuse. And from a benzodiazepine standpoint, we should really very, very rarely be using those as in the healthcare system. They tend to be really band-aids and not effective longer-term solutions. We have better and safer tools. And on the ADHD side, there's just a lot of messiness and confusion. She did feel like there was less risk with stimulants and a slightly safer safety profile, but still a lot of conflict of interest. And so as a company, we decided to steer clear of that and say, we're going to continue to ask people to seek in-person care if they feel like they need one of those medications, and focus and build all of our protocols and offerings around safer, more long-term sustainable solutions. And I think we've all seen what has happened in the market, that there are companies that made very different decisions than we did, and decided to chase that economic opportunity without strong clinical safeguards in place. And it hasn't gone well, and regulatory agencies have gotten involved. I'll say that my takeaway from the market overall is not necessarily that this should never happen. I think we're entering a future with telemedicine where we should take a close look at everything and say, how can we use the tools we have to make care delivery better? I'd say that remote prescribing of controlled meds is just an extra sensitive area, and that if we want to find a way to do it remotely, it's going to require some extra controls built and planned in around safety and quality standards that companies would have to adhere to do it. I haven't seen anything like that proposed or emerge yet, but I think if there's a path forward there, I would hope that that's part of it.
Now, prescribing is part of what you do, and I think you have an offering, Precision RX. Can you explain what that is?
Absolutely. Precision is really at the core of what we do at Brightside. And as I learned about depression and depression treatment overall, one of the biggest challenges in the market that I felt like we need to overcome as both a company and as an industry is the simplistic conceptualization of depression as one thing. We've sort of thought of the criteria for diagnosing depression as look at whether somebody has 5 of 9 symptoms, and if they do, try an SSRI. That's roughly the kind of clinical guidance you'd find in a clinical resource tool that doctors read. And what that really means is they're all kind of the same. It doesn't matter what treatment you try, just give it a guess and see how it goes. And that's been our norm for decades of our clinical standard. What we know about depression and anxiety is actually that it's a highly heterogeneous condition, that it's not one thing, that people can present in very distinct and different ways. One simple way to think about that is that one of the criteria for diagnosing depression is sleep disturbance, as one of those 5 of 9 criteria that you need to have. But you can have insomnia or hypersomnia and satisfy that criteria. So you can have literally the opposite symptoms. So the idea that you're going to take the same treatment and help people with opposite symptoms is just, it underlines how short-sighted and sort of lazy this conceptualization is of what depression really is. If we understand the complexity and heterogeneity of depression and actually think of it as lots of smaller buckets of people with distinct needs under this broad diagnostic umbrella, we can better endeavor to understand their needs, identify them when they present, and map them to the treatment that's going to be most effective for them specifically. And determining that can be a combination of published research, clinical standards, and our own data in this learning cycle where we see what people like them have experienced and improved from, and use that to weight clinical recommendations to the provider at the point of prescribing. So we've got our own clinical decision support tool based on our proprietary algorithms that keep learning, that help our providers choose the right medication. And they choose the right medication over 70% of the time on the first prescription, which is probably double what you'd see in a traditional practice.
Any use of pharmacogenomics?
Actually, no. And interestingly, with my background at 23andMe, I have a fair amount of exposure to genetics and to some really smart geneticists. What I learned there and what those geneticists told me was there's some incremental, interesting information in your genome about how you might respond to antidepressant medication. And if you're someone perhaps who's failed multiple rounds of antidepressants, that could be something worth doing. But that when you look at the actual clinical actionability of the information on those panels today, it's pretty modest. And we actually think we can get substantially more out of a phenotype-driven model, which is sort of your symptoms and other attributes in the way that we're doing it with machine learning than we can out of a pharmacogenomic model. Now, I'll say that we can't write it off. There's still a ton of potential in pharmacogenomics, and I think we all want to advance the science and understanding there. And so in the future, ultimately, I see a hybrid model that's both phenotypes and genotypes coming together to drive the best possible predictions.
So how's the business going overall? Certainly there's plenty of need as you've established. It sounds like you've got the right kind of approach out there. Sounds like you're having some success. How are you doing? How would you measure it?
We're doing great. I mean, this has been a really exciting market. I'm sure everybody knows or can imagine that COVID really accelerated the adoption of telemedicine tools and shone a big light on mental health needs. We started the company long before COVID in 2017, and it really helped to accelerate awareness and adoption. Our focus and the way that has particularly manifested in a productive way for us is that we want to be the highest value partner to payers, providers, and plan sponsors. And so COVID really helped payers quickly see that they needed to embrace virtual solutions. And so we've been able to establish really exciting partnerships for national contracts with Cigna, Aetna, and Optum as part of United Healthcare, as well as a number of large Blues plans. And so that's been a really important accelerant and manifestation for Brightside of being part of the healthcare system. As I mentioned, sort of back from my 23andMe learnings, that we want to be well integrated with the way you tend to pay for your care, the way you find your care, the way you collaborate with a care team. And so that's been really great for driving growth at Brightside. We've continued to invest in our care quality, our safety, growing our team. And we're happy that we raised a Series B with some great investors last year. And our goal is to go, reach everybody who needs care, those who need care the most, and deliver that life-changing care with measurable results.
I'm going to ask you a final question, turning away from the business, and it's about whether you have any time for reading, if there's any books that you might recommend, or as I often ask, any books you recommend to stay away from.
I have found myself actually reading a lot more recently and find it a really good way to relax. But I'll say that when I read, I haven't been choosing to read business books. I'm trying to use it as a way to exercise my brain for other things. And so I do really love nonfiction historically, but I revisited my one favorite fiction book of all time, which is called Shantaram. And I'm reading it again 10 years later, and I'm loving it even more the second time. When it comes to depression, one of the best books written, I think, is The Noonday Demon. Really a firsthand account of what it's like to live with depression and an understanding of that from somebody, or if you're somebody who has not. Another book I'm reading is called Good Inside. I've got 3 little kids, and it's about compassionate parenting and really trying to be intentional about being a present and effective parent. That is something that I'm always mindful of and trying to do better at. And then lastly, I want to recommend Speaking in Thumbs, written by Mimi Winsberg, my co-founder, phenomenal psychiatrist who has taken a lot of complex psychiatric concepts and natural language processing to apply to a lot of real world scenarios where we communicate with each other and we're trying to interpret each other's mental state, and a really easy, fun read with a lot of true substance.
Outstanding. Well, I'm glad I didn't ask for 20 books, because you might have. It sounds like you might have had them. That's a nice portfolio. Well, Brad Kittredge, founder and CEO at Brightside Health, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast.
David, thanks for having me. Really appreciate you.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.